The palace was silent, but not with peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before a blade strikes. Deep inside the Topkapi Palace, under vaulted ceilings heavy with the scent of incense and fear, a new sultan stood barefoot on cold marble. Outside these gilded walls, cannon fire still echoed from the war that had delivered him the throne. But inside, another battle was about to be fought, one far older, far more personal, and infinitely more cruel. In the shadows of a torchlit corridor, his brothers waited, not to celebrate, not to pledge loyalty, but to die. The Ottoman Empire had a way of preventing civil war. It was not a law written on parchment, but on the hearts of every heir to the throne. A simple, ruthless tradition. When a sultan is crowned, his brothers must not live to challenge him. They called it fratricide. But that sterile word hides the horror. For centuries it was dressed as duty, justified as mercy to the empire. Better the death of a few princes than the blood of thousands in a civil war. Or so they claimed. The young sultan's hands trembled, but not from doubt. He had been raised to this moment, fed on whispers that weakness would doom him and the empire alike. Outside, the Janissaries, the elite guard whose loyalty could make or unmake a ruler, stood in rigid formation, their spears glinting in the early dawn. The muezzin's call to prayer echoed faintly, mingling with the rustle of silk robes and the muffled sobs of servants who knew too much. A court executioner, silent and faceless, stepped forward carrying the tool of the ritual, not a sword, but a bowstring, chosen to keep royal blood from spilling on palace floors. In the dim light, it glimmered like a serpent. History remembers this as the price of stability. But for the princes who stood in that room, boys, some barely old enough to wear a beard, it was a betrayal by blood itself. For the Sultan, it was the first act of power, and perhaps the last moment he would ever sleep without seeing their eyes in his dreams. This was the blood-soaked ritual that crowned a new sultan, a tradition forged in war, wrapped in silk, and carried out in shadows. And it was about to change the empire forever.
The Ottoman Empire did not rise in peace. It was born on horseback, in the smoke of burning cities, under the constant drumbeat of war. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, it stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the mountains of Persia to the shores of North Africa. Its capital, Istanbul, stood at the crossroads of the world, where Europe met Asia, where caravans from the Silk Road unloaded spices and silks, and where the ships of three seas converged. Here, power was not merely inherited, it was taken. The Ottoman system of succession was unlike that of most European monarchies. There was no eldest son guaranteed the throne. Instead, every male descendant of the royal family was a legitimate contender. In theory, this encouraged competition, ensuring the most capable rose to rule. In practice, it meant that at the death of a sultan, the empire often erupted into a race, and sometimes a war, between brothers. The Ottomans had seen the cost of that chaos. Civil wars could splinter the empire, open the door for enemies, and burn cities to ash. In a state built on conquest, instability was poison. And so, a brutal solution emerged. This was the law of fratricide, not openly debated in the Divan, Imperial Council, but enforced in the silent corridors of Topkapi Palace. The reasoning was cold: better the execution of a few princes than the slaughter of thousands in a war for succession. The executioners, often mute to preserve secrecy, were trained for years to carry out the task without hesitation. They used a bowstring instead of a blade to avoid spilling royal blood, a gesture meant to soften the act but which only made it more intimate, and more chilling. Behind the palace walls, life was both dazzling and suffocating. The Sultan's court glittered with jewels, silk, and gold, but it was also a cage of politics and suspicion. Foreign ambassadors walked carefully, knowing one wrong word could end their mission, or their lives. The Grand Vizier, the empire's most powerful minister, navigated between serving his master and surviving his rivals. The Janissaries, elite soldiers taken as boys from conquered lands and raised as warriors loyal only to the Sultan, stood as both protectors and potential kingmakers. Beyond the palace, the empire was a patchwork of peoples, languages, and faiths. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived under Ottoman law, paying different taxes and enjoying different rights. The empire's armies marched constantly, against Christian kingdoms in Europe, Shi'ite dynasties in Persia, and rebellious governors in its far-flung provinces. War was the empire's lifeblood, but it was also the source of its instability. Victories brought wealth, captives, and glory. Defeats brought whispers of weakness. A sultan who faltered in war could lose the trust of his soldiers. And in the Ottoman world, losing the soldiers meant losing the throne. That was why succession had to be immediate and decisive. There could be no delay, no months of debate. When a sultan died, the news was often kept secret until his chosen heir reached Istanbul. Then, the ritual began, swift, silent, and final. It was in this crucible of politics, war, and suspicion that the blood-soaked ritual became not just an act of survival, but the very foundation of Ottoman stability. It was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as duty. But there was a darker truth. Every sultan who ascended by fratricide inherited not only the throne but the ghosts of his brothers. And in time, those ghosts would shape the decisions of rulers, driving them toward paranoia, purges, and ever greater acts of oppression to protect their crowns. The stage was set. An empire at its peak, rich, vast, and feared. A palace where gold glittered but shadows ruled. And a tradition that demanded a crown be bought with blood. In the summer of 1595, the Ottoman Empire was still a giant among nations. But like all giants, it had begun to slow. The long and costly wars against the Habsburgs in Europe had drained the treasury, unrest simmered in the provinces, and whispers about the Sultan's aging health spread like smoke. In the marble halls of Topkapi Palace, one man waited for the inevitable, Prince Mehmed, eldest son of Sultan Murad III. He was not a warrior by nature. Raised in the quiet seclusion of the palace, Mehmed had been taught the arts of poetry and calligraphy more than the craft of war. Yet in the Ottoman world, birth was destiny. When his father's body finally gave way to illness, Mehmed would inherit the empire, and everything that came with it. But inheritance in the Ottoman court was never simple. Mehmed's father had left him more than a crown. He had left him 19 brothers, each a living threat to his rule. Some were children, barely old enough to speak, others were young men with enough ambition to rally support among the Janissaries or the provincial governors. In the ruthless mathematics of Ottoman politics, the calculation was simple: if they lived, he might not. The law, sanctioned by centuries of practice and by the edicts of Mehmed's great-grandfather, Sultan Mehmed II, gave the new sultan full authority to order the execution of his brothers. And the Janissaries, whose support he needed desperately, expected him to do it. Mercy was not seen as kindness in Istanbul. Mercy was seen as weakness. The moment came in January 1595. Sultan Murad III died in his bed, and the news was kept secret while guards sealed the palace. Outside, the winter winds lashed the Bosphorus, and inside, preparations began for the most dreaded of imperial customs. Mehmed, now Sultan Mehmed III, sat in his father's chamber. The bowstrings had already been prepared. Smooth, strong cords of silk, capable of tightening around a throat with deadly precision. The executioners, palace deaf-mutes sworn to secrecy, moved silently through the corridors. One by one, the princes were taken from their rooms. There were no trials, no speeches, no prayers loud enough to carry beyond the heavy doors. By dawn, 19 coffins lay in the courtyard. Some contained boys too young to have ever plotted treason. Others held men who might have one day led armies in their brother's name. All were buried quickly, without the pomp of royal funerals. Mehmed had secured his throne, but the air of the palace was heavy with the knowledge of what it had cost. The act sent a clear message: to the Janissaries, to the viziers, to the governors across the empire, the Sultan was not afraid to uphold tradition, no matter how bloody. It bought him time. But it also bought him enemies. That same year, the empire was plunged into war. The long Turkish war against the Habsburgs flared across the Balkans, a grinding conflict of sieges, ambushes, and brutal winters. Mehmed was no soldier, but the demands of the throne forced him to lead in name. His armies clashed with Austrian forces across the Danube, taking and losing fortresses in battles that cost thousands of lives. The Janissaries fought fiercely, but they also grew restless, demanding pay raises, privileges, and greater influence in palace politics. At home, the empire's diverse populations groaned under heavy taxation to fund the war. Peasants in Anatolia revolted, driven by hunger and oppression. Bandits roamed the countryside, sometimes disguised as soldiers, looting villages. The promise of stability, the very reason fratricide had been defended for centuries, seemed to falter under the weight of endless campaigns. Inside Topkapi, Mehmed became increasingly isolated. His mother, the powerful Safavi Sultan, wielded enormous influence over court affairs, acting as both advisor and manipulator. Viziers rose and fell in dizzying succession, many accused of corruption or treachery. But the shadows of the Night of the 19 Brothers never left him. His reign was haunted by suspicion. Ministers were dismissed at the first sign of disloyalty. Governors were executed for imagined plots. Every threat, real or phantom, was met with the same cold decisiveness as that first night. Even in war, the memory of the ritual clung to the Sultan. When the Ottoman armies captured the fortress of Agar in 1596 after a bloody siege, Mehmed ordered a public display of imperial justice. Enemy captives were executed in the square, their heads displayed on pikes, a warning that the Sultan's authority reached beyond the palace walls and into the heart of the battlefield. The people of Istanbul spoke of him in whispers. Some called him Mehmed the Resolute, a ruler who placed the empire above sentiment. Others called him Mehmed the Blood Drinker, a man whose crown rested on the graves of his kin. By the war's end, Mehmed had gained territory, but the victories were costly. The treasury was drained, the army weary, and the provinces restless. And yet, the ritual of fratricide endured, defended by those who believed it had saved the empire from tearing itself apart. But history would remember Mehmed III for one thing above all else. Not for his conquests, not for his reforms, but for that winter night when the palace lights burned until dawn, and 19 princes were silenced forever in the name of stability. By the dawn of the 17th century, the air in Istanbul was thick with unease. The fires of war still burned in Europe, and though the siege at Agar had brought a brief wave of celebration, the Ottoman victories were not decisive enough to silence unrest at home. In Anatolia, whole regions had slipped from imperial control. The Salali rebellions, sparked by crushing taxes, corrupt officials, and the ravages of war, were growing bolder. Bands of rebels, sometimes numbering in the thousands, roamed the countryside. They stormed towns, burned government buildings, and executed Ottoman officials in the public square. To the villagers who had suffered under years of exploitation, they were avengers. To the Sultan, they were traitors. The empire's traditional solution to rebellion was swift, merciless force. Mehmed dispatched provincial governors with orders to pacify the lands. Janissary detachments marched east, burning villages suspected of aiding the rebels, hanging men from the gates of city walls as warnings to others. Yet the more the empire punished, the more the rebellion spread, as if the land itself were rejecting the hand that ruled it. Inside Topkapi Palace, the Sultan's paranoia deepened. He saw the same threat in his own ministers that he saw in the rebels, the possibility of betrayal. In private, he confessed to his mother, Safavi Sultan, that the faces of his 19 brothers still visited him in his dreams, not as children, not as rivals, but as silent accusers. His nightmares made him wary of leaving the palace for long, and every journey was surrounded by layers of armed guards. The Janissaries, whose loyalty had once been assured, now began to grumble openly. The war in Europe had dragged on too long, the pay was too low, and the palace intrigues too frequent. Some Janissary commanders began to hint, not too quietly, that perhaps the empire needed a new ruler. The real turning point came in 1601. News reached the palace that in the distant province of Temesvar, a trusted governor had been murdered by his own soldiers. It was not just an act of rebellion, it was a message. Power was slipping from Istanbul's grasp. Mehmed's response was a mixture of fear and fury. He ordered the execution of suspected conspirators in the capital, not only military officers, but also court officials and even members of wealthy merchant families. Some were guilty, others were simply unlucky enough to have enemies who whispered their names into the right ears. The palace courtyard once again became a stage for public punishment. Prisoners were paraded before the Janissaries, their crimes proclaimed, their bodies displayed after execution. The intention was to terrify potential traitors. But in the coffee houses and markets of Istanbul, the people whispered another story, that the Sultan had turned his thirst for survival inward, striking at his own heart. While the empire's borders strained under foreign pressure, the capital strained under its own fear. Spies and informers multiplied, watching taverns, mosques, and even family gatherings for signs of dissent. Those who spoke against the Sultan, even in private, could disappear before dawn. But repression came at a cost. The same brutality that had once solidified Mehmed's throne now bred a new kind of opposition, not from brothers who shared his blood, but from men and women across the empire who shared nothing but their anger. In 1603, fate struck again. The war in Hungary, already a grinding stalemate, turned against the Ottomans. At the fortress of Kanij, Ottoman forces were nearly routed before a desperate counterattack saved them from disaster. The victory was hollow. Supplies were dwindling, morale was collapsing, and the treasury was bleeding silver faster than it could be replenished. Mehmed was faced with the same question that had haunted his reign from the first day: how far was he willing to go to keep his crown? For him, the answer had never changed. As rebellion simmered and enemies closed in, the Sultan turned to the only method he had ever truly trusted: the elimination of threats, no matter how high the cost. But this time, the threats were no longer just brothers in a palace. They were everywhere, in the provinces, in the army, in the streets of the capital. And in his final years, as the empire staggered under the weight of war and repression, the blood-soaked ritual that had crowned him would come to be seen not as the salvation of the empire, but as the shadow that had doomed it. When Sultan Mehmed III died in December 1603, he was only 37 years old. His death came suddenly, an illness that spread quickly, robbing him of breath within days. In the cold of winter, the palace sealed itself again, just as it had 8 years before, when the news of his father's passing had been hidden from the city until the chosen heir was ready to take the throne. But this time, something was different. His successor, Ahmed I, was just 13 years old, a boy with no sons of his own and, crucially, brothers still alive. The ritual that had defined Ottoman succession for more than a century suddenly seemed dangerous in a new way. Killing all possible heirs would have left the dynasty with a single child on the throne and no one to take his place if disaster struck. In the days after Mehmed's death, the divan debated quietly. Some argued that tradition must be upheld, that to spare Ahmed's brothers was to invite chaos. Others whispered that the empire had bled enough for the sake of stability, that the slaughter of princes had not prevented rebellion or civil war, only shifted it into other forms. The decision was made in silence, but it was historic. Ahmed I would not order the execution of his brothers. Instead, they were confined within the palace in a section that came to be known as the caves, the cage. Here, potential heirs lived under constant watch, cut off from the outside world, free from the threat of the bowstring, but condemned to a different kind of death. A life of isolation, boredom, and paranoia. This shift marked the beginning of the end for the blood-soaked ritual. It did not vanish overnight. For decades, some sultans still resorted to fratricide when they deemed it necessary. But Ahmed's decision created a precedent, one born not from mercy, but from political necessity. The empire Mehmed left behind was both strong and strained. On paper, it still controlled vast territories across 3 continents. Its armies were feared, its cities glittered with mosques and markets, and its fleets dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had widened. The wars against the Habsburgs had drained the treasury. The Salali rebellions in Anatolia had never been fully extinguished, and the empire's once loyal Janissaries were more politically ambitious than ever. The brutality of Mehmed's early reign had bought him time, but it had also alienated powerful factions. For many, the 19 coffins carried out of Topkapi Palace in January 1595 became a symbol, not of stability, but of excess. Poets and chroniclers, careful with their words, recorded the event with unease. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in disbelief at the scale of the executions. In the markets of Istanbul, storytellers turned it into a cautionary tale, that a ruler who sheds too much blood will one day find himself drowned in it. In the decades after Mehmed's death, the Ottoman court became more secretive, more bound by ritual, and more dominated by palace politics. The caliphs kept princes alive, but it also produced rulers who had spent their youth in confinement, unprepared for the realities of governing an empire at war. The tradition of fratricide had been born in the heat of conquest, when strong rulers needed to act decisively to hold their empires together. By the time Mehmed III died, the empire was shifting into a different age. One of drawn-out wars, entrenched bureaucracy, and palace intrigue. The bloody efficiency of the bowstring gave way to the slow suffocation of the cage. Still, the shadow of that night in 1595 lingered. Every sultan who followed knew the choice that had once been his to make, whether to kill his brothers or spare them, and every prince who lived in the caliphs knew the choice that had once claimed the lives of 19 boys. In the long sweep of Ottoman history, Mehmed III's reign was neither the most glorious nor the most disastrous. But it was among the most haunting. His ascent had been secured with a ritual that shocked even the hardened courtiers of Topkapi Palace. His reign had been marked by war, rebellion, and repression. And his death had triggered a decision that quietly rewrote the rules of imperial succession. The empire would survive for another 3 centuries, but the days when a new sultan's first act was to drench the palace in blood were gone, replaced by the cold, silent captivity of the cage. The blood-soaked ritual that crowned Mehmed III was not born from cruelty alone. It was born from fear. Fear of losing power, fear of civil war, fear that the empire itself might fracture if succession was left to chance. But fear is a poor architect for the future. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide is remembered today as one of the most ruthless systems of succession in history. Yet for those who enforced it, it was a form of order, a terrible necessity in a world where hesitation could mean the death of the state. That was the contradiction at the heart of the empire, the belief that survival demanded sacrifice, even when the sacrifice was one's own blood. It is tempting to view it through the distance of centuries, as a relic of a brutal age. But the truth is more unsettling. The logic behind it, the idea that stability justifies cruelty, has echoed through history far beyond the Ottoman walls. From royal courts to revolutionary governments, leaders have repeated the same grim calculation: better the lives of a few than the chaos of many. In Mehmed III's time, the calculation claimed 19 brothers in a single night. In our own, it takes different forms: the silencing of rivals, the crushing of dissent, the shaping of laws to secure power. The tools have changed. The principle has not. The ritual's legacy also shaped the Ottoman Empire long after the bowstrings were set aside. The caliphs, the cage that replaced the executions, kept potential heirs alive but unprepared, creating rulers whose first steps into the world came when they inherited a throne. Stability was preserved in one sense, but at the cost of weakening the very men who were meant to lead. Mehmed III's story, and the tradition that made him sultan, still matters because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power. Power rarely changes hands peacefully. Those who seek it are often willing to spill blood, whether on a battlefield, in a palace chamber, or through the quiet machinery of politics. And the justification is often the same: that the ends outweigh the means. But history, as always, delivers its verdict in the long run. The Ottoman Empire, for all its splendor and strength, could not escape decline. Its rulers, once feared across continents, eventually became prisoners of their own traditions. And the empire that had killed to preserve itself slowly died in other ways, through stagnation, corruption, and the slow erosion of its foundations. The Night of the 19 Coffins was more than an episode of palace history. It was a mirror, reflecting the extremes to which a state will go to protect itself, and the haunting truth that those extremes can leave wounds deeper than the dangers they were meant to prevent. Standing in the quiet courtyards of Topkapi Palace today, it is hard to imagine the sounds that once filled these walls, the whispered orders, the muffled struggles, the silence that followed. But the marble remembers. The stones remember. And if history has a voice, it whispers still. Power taken in blood can never be truly free of it.